to everyone. Patron Shri B.S. Raghavan Sir, Director General Commodore R.S. Vasan, dignitaries on the dais, distinguished members of C3S, veterans from the armed forces and serving officers, dignitaries from foreign missions, friends from media, participants who are joining live, and researchers. On behalf of the entire team of C3S, we welcome you to the book launch of China's space program from the era of Mao Zedong to Xi Jinping, authored by Professor S Chandrashekar. China's space ambitions have come a long way. When the world was under the grasp of Cold War and intense space competitions by the two superpowers, China's space ambitions were minimal. Reportedly, Mao Zedong went on to say that China cannot even put a potato in space. 70-odd years later, China has become a major player in the field of space with a resolve to become the leading space power by 2024. China, over the past few years, have made it clear their ambitions in space by means of notable undertakings, such as landing a rover on the rare far side of the moon, sending an uncrewed mission to Mars, which made China the second nation to ever land a craft on Mars. In this regard, the book China's Space Program from the era of Mao Zedong to Xi Jinping will have an important role to play in understanding the journey of China's space program. I now take this opportunity to introduce the author of the book, Professor S Chandrashekar, Emeritus Professor, National Institute of Advanced Studies. Professor S Chandrashekar is the J.R.D. Tata Visiting Professor at the National Institute of Advanced Studies. He spent more than 20 years working at the Indian Space Research Organization on satellite, rocket, as well as the applications of space technology, especially remote sensing. As Deputy Director of Earth Observation System, he was also in international matters relating to space. He has been a member and leader of Indian delegates to the UN committees on the peaceful uses of outer space. We welcome you, sir. May I now introduce Rear Admiral S. Venkat Raman, VSM, Flag Officer Commanding Tamil Nadu, Puducherry Naval Area. Rear Admiral S. Venkat Raman was commissioned into the executive branch of the Indian Navy in 1990. He is a specialist in communications and electronics warfare, and he has tenanted various appointments abroad, Navy's frontline warships. He was the executive officer of the aircraft carrier Virat. He has served on the staff of the Flag Officer Commanding Western Fleet. He was the Commandant, Naval War College, Goa, prior to taking over his present appointment. He was awarded Vishisht Seva Medal in 2019 for his distinguished service by the Honorable President of India. We welcome you, sir, to the event. Now, I take this opportunity to invite Professor S. Chandrashekar, sir, to talk about the book.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you very much for calling me Commodore Vasan, Rear Admiral, to take time off to come and do an academic kind of thing that we do very often here. I think all the members of C3S who took a lot of trouble and effort in order to put this event together, I am very, very grateful. Thank you very, very much. It is an honor and a privilege to be associated with C3S. I have been coming here often and exchanging views and had discussions with a very distinguished bunch of extremely experienced and knowledgeable, I would argue, analysts, strategic thinkers, and maybe all kinds of things that they do extremely well. I have to confess that I am truly amazed at the kind of things that you people have been doing, and I wish I could help in any form that I could. I think you are doing a remarkable effort, and I hope that I can contribute to that. I thought that before I go into the details of this book on China's space program, I would tell you a little bit about how the book happened. Okay, and it's a kind of thing that happens to you basically because you were lucky enough to start off at some place at the right time, and maybe you had associated with you a set of great people with whom you have interacted and who have contributed a lot to something that happens. So I would like to give you a brief review of how the book came into being first, and then give you a little bit about the sample about the book itself. So can I have the first slide, please? Yeah. I would, all that I know about space, about life, I learned from this great architect of the Indian space program. This is Professor Satish Dhawan, with whom I worked closely for a period of about 12, 14 years during the formative stages of one's life. And he was this remarkable Indian, true patriot, a very modest man who never talks very much about himself, but he made an impact on all of us who worked very closely with him. And if at all I have to do anything in space, I owe him a lot. He was really a kind of mentor and a guiding spirit, and one of the most humane persons I've ever met. I wish he would be here to have looked at the book. I'm sure he would have given you a very constructive review of it. I would also like to say, that this book would not have been possible without the help of a lot of my colleagues. Okay, many of them are not named very, but I mean a lot of it came from them. Can I have the next slide, please? Yeah. One of my colleagues, Dr. Kasturi Rangan, became the director of NIAS in 2005 or 2006. I don't remember the date very well. And he called me one day and he wanted me to come and help NIAS with kind of reorienting a strategic studies program that had already been there. And so I kind of, it's very difficult to say no to Dr. Rangan, and I therefore had to agree. And I went there with the idea of trying to provide a kind of different focus to some of the work that was already going on. Now, NIAS had already established some kind of a reputation for the nuclear side of the program because Dr. Raman was the founder, and Professor Radha Narasimha, who succeeded him, was also pretty involved in all the strategic part. And I had therefore to find a new focus for what one had to do. So I thought that we could look at two countries, Pakistan, an immediate concern, and of course China, we thought at that time was a bigger, slightly bigger concern, more of a medium range concern. And we picked ballistic missiles as the first area we would look at, and Pakistan, simply because I had done some work earlier in ISRO, and it looked like that would be a promising area for us to make a beginning on what proved to be the final thing that we did on China. Can I have the next slide, please? Yeah. Now, what we did in that, in our approach was that we wanted to be different, and we wanted to use a technology lens in order to understand, right, what Pakistan was doing. So we developed a lot of methodologies which looked at the technical data. So we used a lot of images of the Pakistan missiles. We could make measurements on those images, and we had with us the expertise to take those measurements and convert them into something like propulsion parameters that is critical for the success of a missile. And then we had a very crude trajectory program that we had used in order to estimate the performance of these missiles. Now, through this approach, we also wanted to look at what does it take to make a missile, what does it take to make it in large numbers, how is it deployed, what kinds of other facilities are required. So there's also an element about operationalizing it and what is required for that. So the organization part and the production part and the deployment part became an important part. And of course, the other questions that arises, how is it going to be used? How is it linked to the nuclear weapons program? So we had to look at things like decision making, game theory, social networks. So using this technical lens, we kind of looked at all of these things, and we came out with a report on Pakistan's missile program. I think it's now kind of outdated, but 2006 or so we produced this. It was received well, right? And we thought that we would then extend it to look at some of the other stuff. Can I I have the next slide, please? So the logical follow-up to that study was to look at China, which had a much bigger program at that time too. And therefore, you see here a typical list of some of the ballistic missiles. And I happened to come across a couple of fantastic books which looked at the development of China's SLBM, for example. It's very well put out. And we used all this publicly available knowledge in order to put together a kind of brief on China. At this time, we had a very crude trajectory program that we had developed. My colleague from ISRO, Dr. Raman, joined us at NIAS, and he is one of the most gifted programmers that I know, and very insightful developer of software. So we have developed a very unique kind of software called CoWADIS, which enables us to kind of launch the missile from anywhere in the world, and we can look at targets anywhere else in the world, and we can look at different kinds of trajectories, a lofted trajectory, a shallow trajectory, the maximum range trajectory, and all that. So it's a very versatile software. My colleague is here in case anybody is interested to know what it can do. We can actually display some of the stuff that we have done. So we used all these combinations in order to build up a very strong database on China's missiles and their performance, along with things like organization, decision making, all that stuff. So that was something that we did. Can I have the next slide, please? Yeah. So just to give you a picture, you can actually use those images to make all kinds of inferences. For example, we can look at the lengths of the missile and find out what has changed from one image to the other. We can look at the payload part and see what kinds of things are happening. So all these things are just to give you a sample of the kinds of things you can do with the simple analysis of a lot of these images. Can I have the next one, please? Next slide. Yeah. For example, you can look at the warhead itself and make certain inferences if you know a little bit about it. Okay, I don't want to go into the details, so a lot of it can be done. Can I have the next slide, please? And then, of course, in 2007, China did the ASAT test. And you know that everybody suddenly woke up and it became a major crisis, okay? And of course, nobody knew about the test, incidentally. I think US sources had to tell us before we actually knew that the Chinese had carried out an ASAT test. At least that's the kind of input that I got. Maybe I'm wrong, but it looked very clear to me at that time when I was talking to various people that we did not really have a means of knowing, right, what China had done. Okay, it took a few days for us to figure out, and then of course it became major news. Can I have the next slide, please? Then in 2010, another event happened, which again largely went unnoticed in the Indian strategic establishment. There were reports that the Chinese had come up with what is called an anti-ship ballistic missile. Okay, when we do the second session, I'll talk a little bit more about the Taiwan crisis. But a lot of it has to do with the US naval presence in the Pacific Ocean and their ability to target any part of the world through the projection of power using these aircraft carriers. Okay. And one of the problems is, how does the missile actually locate a target and is then able to go and hit it? And the obvious answer was they have to have satellites, okay? Because over the horizon capability is going to be very difficult to do with the conventional methods, okay? And Dr. Admiral Raja Menon actually referred this problem to us because we were still dabbling bits and pieces of it. And then we took upon us to take a look at it. And to us, it seemed obvious that they needed a very large area surveillance capability if they were able to actually feed such a missile. So that's the first time we actually started seriously looking at China. I'd done a little bit of work on China when I was in ISRO, but I kind of left it behind. So this was the first time when we actually looked at the Chinese space capabilities to find out what they have been doing. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, and it was lucky because as soon as we looked at the data, we came across a particular configuration of a satellite launch. And it involved the launch of 3 satellites. And if you looked at their orbital parameters, you can see that they were very close together. And they were patterned like a triangle, and the spacing between them was very clear. And they were in a very particular orbit, 1200 kilometers and 63.4-degree inclination. And all the 3 satellites were launched together in one rocket, okay? Now this is a dead giveaway. From my ISRO knowledge, I could make out that this is a dead giveaway for what is called a National Ocean Surveillance Satellite. Okay, this is something that the Americans had done in the 70s, and this is a typical signature for such a capability. Now what does an alien surveillance do? It covers a very large area of the ocean, and you can locate any emitter within a certain radius, a smaller radius, within that larger coverage area. And therefore, it definitely told us that they have the capability to do a large surveillance of the ocean and locate an emitting object within that area, okay? And in a sense, it established credibility to the claim that they were indeed fielding an anti-ship ballistic missile, right? This was, so we had written a big report on this, and it was one of a major set of presentations we also made in Delhi at that time. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? This is just to tell you the launch and the difference you can see even from a launch picture about the ocean surveillance system and the other kinds. If it's a high-resolution SAR or a high-resolution optical, the launch vehicle configuration itself is very different. And therefore, from public sources, you can actually figure out some of these things. It's not very difficult to do. Yeah. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Is it okay? Yeah. Okay. So can I have the next slide, please? So this then made us look at the Chinese space capabilities in greater detail. And we started about 2014 or so. I've been periodically updating this thing. So we did a complete assessment of China's space capabilities because of all this background. And this book that I'm talking about is actually a consequence of a lot of that work. Of course, I think we've been doing 3 or 4 updates of it. And all the reports that we put out on the Yagon satellites that we have become extensively quoted. I think RAND has used some of our data. And we became quite well known in some of the US circles about some of this work, okay? I don't know whether it made a major impact on India, but definitely other countries saw some value in it, okay? Okay, can I have the next slide, please? Yeah. What does the book talk about? The first part of the book is about the origins and the evolution of the program to current day. So it covers the entire period from about 1956, when this great father of China's space program called Ten Shih-chen, he came back. He was thrown out from the US as a spy. He came back to China, and in a sense, you can argue that he was the father of the space program. So this book documents all about that part, how he came. What period is, of course, the Mao period in Chinese history. And it is a period when the space program, nascent capabilities, it actually became a subset of the missile program originally. Before then it became, and transformed the space program into a more commercial-driven program, and how the space program became a little bit of a non-entity, and how it became once again a powerful entity towards the end of its regime is well documented. Then it became the new threat to the United States. It's just the transition period is kind of covered. And then finally, the growth part of China's space program. So can I have the next slide, please? So the other part of the book actually covers, provides in detail each of the functional areas in space. So recoverable satellites were the first kinds of satellites that the Chinese launched. Communication satellites, the Chinese are now suppliers of communication satellites to the rest of the world. They, I think, have provided about 13 or 15 delivered in orbit kind of communication. I'll talk a little bit when I do. Then the weather capabilities of their satellites, remote sensing satellites, the navigation satellite constellation. We covered extensively the human spaceflight program. Then, of course, space science and applications, the moon missions, the Mars missions, the entire history of why they wanted to go to Mars or the moon, and the politics between the CAS and the rest of the Chinese establishment, the role of the PLA, all that is covered. Organized launching from the LOC area. They have mobile launchers. They can do multiple launches from from several of the launch bases, and all that is covered in detail. And then, of course, the final part deals with the international part of China's space program. All the international connections, commercial as well as other kinds of connections are all documented. Okay, all the satellites launched by China from 1970 to 2020 are covered, including all the launches also, of course. Okay. So, can I have the next slide, please? Just to give you a flavor of the final, what I call the assessment, overall assessment, which is in the first part of the book. This tells you that China has launched 678 satellites. And if you look at the period from, say, 2010 onwards, you can see there is a huge exponential growth in Chinese space capabilities. So the space and the space capabilities is a critical part of Chinese, what I call power activities. I'll talk just a little bit at the end about it. Can I have the next slide, please? Yeah. This tells you all the breakup of the different kinds of satellites. The commercial satellites, they have launched 73 commercial satellites, which means they get paid for launching. Can I have the next one? Yeah. So you can see this is the percentage of the different types of satellites that we've launched. Okay. Can I go to the next one, please? Yeah. So the Chinese have about 301 satellites, military satellites they've launched so far. If you take out the commercial launches, about 50% of China's satellite launches are all military. Okay, they all have a military purpose. It includes C4, ISR, navigation, LNT, BMD, ASAT combinations, human flight. They also do a lot of testing. Okay, a lot of test launches. Can I have the next one, please? Can I have the next one? This is just the percentage. We can go on. Okay. So they have about 396 total launches, about 29 failures, a reliability of about 93%. Just to set the record straight, in 2020, which the book ends, they had 39 launches. I think the Americans had 44, right? 44, please. Yeah. So one part is, if you look at the current trends, as I said, about 678 satellites, and we kind of look at the evolution of this industry or the capability, I think the space industry or the space capabilities in the world is going to increase exponentially, and China is also going to increase exponentially. But the projected numbers we have is about 1,600 or 1,700 satellites by about 2040. So there is going to be a huge growth. And I think the US is now getting ahead of China, so the Chinese are going to respond. So I believe this is an underestimate. Okay, I think the reality is going to be much more than that. Okay, can I have the next one, please? So if you do the analysis that we have done in the book, we get this clear picture that Chinese are well equipped, right, in all realms that are needed for what is called their anti-access area denial strategy. It has significant LNT, SAR, standard optical navigation, communications, tracking and detail satellites, everything is there. They have an operational LNT capability. They have an over-the-horizon radar, a couple of them, right? They can do early warning, recent launches. They can also look at missile launches, maybe from geostationary orbit. They have done a reorganization, and they have now the organization in place to put all these things together. And they are looking at fighting what is called fighting and winning a local war under conditions of what they call informationalization. Okay, so I would argue they have the missile, and they have a whole lot of other things that they can do, all the support infrastructure that they can do. And one would therefore assume that they are possibly the only power in the world that can give the US a kind of challenge. And the challenge will increasingly also happen clearly in space. Okay, because I think space is critical for the US warfighting doctrine. I mean, whatever they have to do. And therefore, targeting targets in space will be an essential component of any one of these local wars also that they're talking about. Can I have the next slide, please? And if you look at the current space order, I think the number of operational satellites as of the middle or the early part of 2021, we had about 4084 satellites in orbit. 2,505 are the US, 431 are Chinese, okay? And you can look at the rest of the countries. Now, I would like to say something about what the US has done. Out of those 2,505 satellites, 1,660 or a little bit more than that belongs to one person called Elon Musk. He alone has more satellites in orbit than everybody else put together, okay? And that is the kind of power that the US is now pushing. And I believe that the US, China is the only country that can counter that kind of power. I believe the Chinese are going to respond in kind, and they are already starting to go ahead and push their, I would argue, their ventures into space in a big way. So just to give you a picture, the US has now caught up maybe, and it's still heading, but the Chinese are the only people who can come close to it, okay? So you can see that the other countries really are kind of following, whereas the competition is clearly between these two major players. And if you look at the military front, the Chinese are almost on par with the US. So you can see they are approximately same. I think the US may not tell you everything about what they have. So maybe this 216 that I'm talking about is a little bit of an underestimate. The numbers could be higher. Okay, so this is really the kind of thing that's going to happen. And I believe that space is going to be the critical domain that's going to determine any kind of result or outcome in any one of the information conflicts that we should see coming up in the next 10, 15 years. Okay. Can I have the next slide, please? So this is a kind of roadmap about where we are. Clearly, the whole industry, the space industry globally is growing. The US is possibly growing also very fast. The only ones who are close to it are the Chinese, okay? Europe and Russia is behind. It's likely to fall even further behind is what I would argue, although one cannot rule out that the focus on space is going to increase after the Ukraine war. Europe is doing okay, but it's still nowhere near what the other countries are doing. France, India, and Japan are kind of behind. Now you could debate whether these positions are correct, but I would argue that France, India, and Japan are clustered a little bit behind the other countries. So there is a huge potential, even for countries like us, to actually push not only the military part, which I've talked about, but also the civilian part. It's a huge growth opportunity for all of us. Can I have the next slide, please? So coming to the end of what I have to say, the Chinese have successfully used space to kind of project their national power. They've used it for political purposes. The book traces the original origins, the manned program, the human space flight program, their forays into the moon, going to Mars. All of it has a lot of political impact. They are a pretty big economic power in the space. They export satellites, satellite services. They sell communication satellites delivered in orbit. I think 50% of one of the Chinese satellites is owned by Sri Lanka. Okay, I mean they've sold half of it to Sri Lanka. Okay, that's one of the things they have. So I think a lot of it we have to see when we look at other kinds of relations. And of course they are a very strong space military power. So their space is, and now with their forays to the moon, Mars, they have the first quantum communication key satellite in the world. They have the first X-ray pulsar satellite in the world. X-ray pulsars can be used to provide precision timing. If you go into deep space, you can use the pulsar rotation rates to fix the time. Okay, so time for navigation in deep space, you can actually use the science of pulsars to do that. They are the first country in the world to do that, and they have a pretty strong space science program also. So they are actually all aspects of this are therefore integral to their way of looking at their comprehensive national power. So space is an important component of their national power projections across the world. Okay, so the book kind of ends with, the first part of the book ends with this kind of message, and a lot of the details are there. There are snippets. For example, the ion propulsion, which is a critical technology for taking satellites from geostationary transfer orbit to geostationary orbit. The Chinese are not yet caught up with the Americans, so we have a section. The Chinese tried to get atomic clocks from Europe, right? And they were part of the original Galileo project that is kind of covered. I think one snippet talks about accidents, some of the major disasters that the Chinese have had. All that is there in the report. In the first part, the networks, the social networks between the political leaders, and the space scientists and the military are very well covered in terms of networks and social connections. All that is covered in detail. I think there is also an estimate somewhere in the book about the impact of sanctions and how US sanctions on China have hurt China in terms of actual quantifiable numbers that we can actually come up with for some part of it. So, and there are many more snippets interspersed in the book that will give you a flavor of some of the issues that are there. Okay, I think I have said what I want to say. I would like to thank C3S for giving me this opportunity for publicizing this book and talking about it. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir, for giving a brief overview of your book and an insightful presentation. May I request the dignitaries to please take seat on the dais. Now it is time for the much awaited moment, the launch of the book. May I kindly request Rear Admiral S. Venkat Raman to release the book and hand over the first copy to Professor S. Chandrashekar, Commodore R.S. Vasan, and Professor V.S. Ramamurthy. Thank you, dignitaries. It is my honor to call upon Rear Admiral S. Venkat Raman to propose the special address. Over to you, sir.
Commodore Vasan, Director General of the Chennai Center for China Studies, eminent guests, ladies and gentlemen, this is an unenviable task for me to speak after such an eminent person, Professor Chandrashekar, and thank you for giving me this chance, sir. Firstly, it's indeed my honor and a proud privilege that I got this chance to speaking and sharing my thoughts with such eminent personalities, gentlemen who have been at the forefront of national security when we were much younger, learning from them. And it's indeed quite an humbling thought that I'm in this audience here. We've heard Prof S Chandrashekar, and his book, I must say, is a timely and a substantial addition to the body of knowledge that we have on China, especially the space program, which is not much. And I speak purely from a security and military perspective in the maritime context. The knowledge on China's space program is only evolved in the last 8-10 years. I do recall about 6-7 years back, at the height of the Doklam crisis, we were trying to grapple with the knowledge on the Yao series of satellites, and that's when the head of my China desk came upon Prof Chandrashekhar's paper and Dr. Ramani's paper, and we used that as the foundation and benchmark to evolve our strategies and concepts. And thank you so much, sir, for that work. It's indeed a benchmark on the understanding of Chinese space satellite systems. And since then on, our knowledge has increased many folds. And this particular book, I'm sure what I heard sir speak, is going to indeed add to our knowledge. For many years in the military, in the security establishment, space and space-based imagery were synonymous. All of us understood space is only satellite imagery. The Navy was a bit smarter, as always. In the late 80s, largely because of two reasons. One is because of the Inmarsat services provided by the IMO those days. We understood that space is beyond much more than just satellite imagery. And subsequently, because of blue water operations, requires over-the-horizon communications. And radio frequency communications over the horizon is only HF. And HF has got a particular vulnerability of interception. Not only of communication interception, but also position fixing. So our operations were limited to VHF ranges. Even a carrier task force, a blue water force, could only operate within line of sight communication. And that's where satellites came into play. So these two things led the Navy into working towards space-based systems. And over the years, of course, in 2007, we had our first satellite dedicated for the Navy, the Rukmani. That completely changed the way the Navy operates today. As you would be aware, we operate across all the oceans. On 15th of August, we had naval ships across 6 countries, across 3 continents, each being communicating to each other as if we are next to each other. So that's where space has come into the naval domain. And today's space, as also with cyber, are the new domains for warfare, apart from the traditional land, sea, and air. And there's very little distinguish between civilian use of space or cyber and military use. It's almost, the line is diffused. Everything from space or space-based systems, or the space itself, as Prof Chandrashekar brings out, can also be for military use. So we need to remain ahead of the curve, and it's thanks to our space pioneers that India is also right there up front with the rest of the world as far as space technology is concerned. And ISRO, we are really proud of ISRO because it's really a world-class institution that we have built up purely from our own efforts. And that's where I think I'm a firm believer of our own self-reliance in our own systems. Too much of dependence from abroad, especially in times of crunch, they don't turn up, technologically especially. And that's where ISRO and our space systems knowledge is truly indigenous. As I won't take much time. Like I said, it's a tough task to follow up such eminent personalities to speak, but I'll just recount what Thucydides said, the Greek historian and the author of Peloponnesian War. The strong will do what they must, the weak must suffer what they must. So we need to be strong, and that means we need to be indigenous. Thank you once again, sirs, for inviting me. Indeed a real honor to be here, and my officers here, both from the Navy and the Coast Guard, I'm sure they have learned something, and the aim was to expose them to newer thoughts, newer processes, and more importantly, Indian thoughts. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you very much, sir. I now invite Commodore R.S. Vasan, Director General C3S, to address the gathering.
Thank you, Sapna. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Our guest of honor, Prof S Chandrashekar, Professor Ramurthy, Flag Officer Tamil Nadu area, Admiral Venkat, Raman, friends from the Navy, Coast Guard, foreign dignitaries, I'm happy to see you. Dobre Utra. And so it's wonderful having all of you today here. And there could have been no better occasion than this one to start looking at and evaluating this Chinese space program. Our own exposure has been quite limited. And about 5 years ago, we were the only think tank in India, which commemorated the 30th anniversary of India-China's S&T collaboration. Not that there was great collaboration, but it was on paper. But we marked that occasion and we requested Prof S Chandrashekar to come over here, and we conducted a program in the Institute of Mathematical Science, Taramani. And where, it was the first time, our eyes really opened up wide, because the gap that he brought out in terms of, where we stood vis-a-vis Chinese space program was startling. So thereafter, of course, every year we started having this program which was dedicated to our S&T vertical. And it is one of these, endeavors that took us to NIAS. Bala, our senior research officer, and self, we were asked to visit NIAS, not for his program, but for Dr. Subhachandran, who has about 7 to 8 PhD candidates working with him. And that was related to the Indo-Pacific initiatives. So we interacted with him, and we did not want to lose any time, and called up these eminent scientists who are here. That's Professor Chandrashekar, Professor Ramurthy, and so Professor Ramani always remains to remain in the back seats. But he's another eminent scientist over here with us. We called on them, and that's when he showed us the kind of work that's been done in the space segment. What appealed to me most was that there's one small book, a green book, 2015 edition, and he showed us that. And of course, we brought a copy and we started reading that. But there's so much that's been covered. And what struck me most was that in 2015, he had carried out a complete evaluation of the space program of India. And he had also indicated as to what government of India should do, what the scientific community should do, and what the rest of us should do. Regrettably, when we visited NIAS and looked at this, I came back and I gave the task to one of my researchers. I said, just please find out what are the recommendations that I've made and what are the recommendations that we've actually adopted or have started working upon. To cut the story short, we are where we are and China is where they are. And but not that we are not bridging the gap, but it will take a long while. That's our assessment after having read through this. Another important point I must bring to your notice is that when this book was published, I'm not sure how many Indian scholars, policy makers had a look at it, but let me tell you, it was China which looked at it first. Not only did they look at it first, they translated into Chinese with the permission of the author, and they made it available to their stakeholders. You know where the difference lies. It's the kind of seriousness they showed. Specifically, I'm sure they looked at the recommendations that were made by Professor Chandrashekar on what the Indian establishment should do. And therefore, I will not be surprised if some of these recommendations were adopted by them, while we perhaps failed to adopt these resolutions. That is the harsh reality, ladies and gentlemen. And so therefore, I'm very happy personally that we are able to get this team across from here. They drove down all the way from Bangalore to be here. This was a program in making, so I would like to you all to thank me in applauding their effort of coming all the way, trying to sensitize you in this great effort. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sirs, for being here with us. From our side, as far as the Chennai Center for China Studies is here, I was explaining to, of course, FOTNA and others as to how we work. Work entirely because of the kind of efforts and support that we get from our members, who are all sitting here in the front. Ambassador Ganapati, Raja Ramathu Krishnan, Sridharan Subramaniam, Colonel Hariharan, and Mr. Shivraman. So they go out of their way to support us. And not only do they support you morally, but it also they put their hands into their deep pockets, pull it out. I don't know how those pockets are deep, we never explode, but they dig deep and put it out and put it there and tell us, here is some money and use it. So we are very happy with what we've been doing, because S&T forms a vertical in our programs, and therefore there's a greater emphasis and we are interacting with researchers and other scholars. And during the COVID, we also had many of these talks, which are all available on our website, to bring out the nuances of SNT in application of comprehensive national power. The slide that Professor Chandrashekar brought out. There he brought out vital components of knowledge, economic power, military power, and political power, and of course soft power and hard power, which he brought out together. So all these are not going to be easy unless there is a national commitment and approach. There have been some changes in the way we looked at these challenges, and but like I said, there are miles to go. So here is where the efforts of people like Professor Chandrashekar, Professor Ramurthy and Ramani should not go unnoticed, and the community which is there should start looking at it. I think the National Security Advisory Board also has some participation by the NIAS, but I think this is concretization of plans, checking out the 5-yearly plan and synchronizing it with our own SNT capability. That's important. Personally speaking, in 2007, when the ASAT technology was demonstrated by China, I did write about it, trying to dig in deep into various things, and it was published in many circles. The point is that at that time there were concerns about the debris, because the satellite was destroyed, but there were debris all over, and there was concern to say that it would come in the way of some of the functioning of our own satellites and other satellites which are in orbit. Thereafter, India did react, which is what we always do. We always react, and we are not proactive in our approach, and that's perhaps something to do with the national psyche. Things are changing, but maybe at the same pace that we want. So thereafter, there have been many of these applications in space and things, and over the tea he might share some of the details. He did not want to share some of the details. He's been the SIGINT head. He was the DNI for more than 5 years. So looking at specifically on some of the capabilities, which he may not share with you today, but in general terms he'll be able to respond to your queries. So we are very grateful to you, Admiral Venkat, Raman, for coming here and talking to us. So the Indian Navy itself, the fact that he mentioned, I would only like to cover a few aspects of the Indian Navy's endeavors with space. As I said, we are in the forefront. Whether you like it or not. Are there any army people besides Colonel Hariharan? Any Air Force people here? So I can still say that Navy has been the forefront of indigenization in terms of Atmanirbharata. What the country is talking about Atmanirbharata, we thought about it in the 60s, and in 72 we had our own Nilgiri which came out. So that's the kind of advantage that we've had. And as you are aware, we commissioned our own aircraft carrier recently, and it's Vikrant, re-christened Vikrant, for which I was very fortunate and honored to be present there at the commissioning ceremony. So the use of importance for satellite, not just for meteorological observation, but for other communication requirements, comment, SIGINT, has been acutely felt by the Indian Navy. And they started coming to surprise in exercise Malabar, which Admiral will watch for. So at that time, when we carried out exercise Malabar, the capability was so limited. The US ships which carried out this exercise had to place their satellite receiver terminals on our ships. And we come a long way. We have our own Project Rukmini. It's in the public domain to some of it. The Project Rukmini is what is at the center of what we continue to call as network-centric operations and network-centric warfare. So these are two essential components of how the modern navies conduct their war. A lot of disruptive technology is coming to be. Now I'm specifically referring to the drones which are going to come there. 3 days ago you saw a report about the extra large underwater unmanned vehicle, the drone. These are going to disrupt your picture, whether surface picture, your air picture, your subsurface picture is going to be disrupted. And so for which you require phenomenal help of AI and blockchains and other things which have to be integrated into your sensors, weapons packages. Only when that is done will you be able to counter the threat which was there. Professor Chandrashekar brought out about the A2AD. He will also talk about it. No, I don't want to talk about everything because we have 3 more sessions today, and we will be getting a chance, particularly for the younger community, to ask these questions on the impact of A2AD. So as far as the A2AD is concerned, the primary purpose was very clear. was to push the threat envelope for China outwards beyond the first and second defense lines. Now, traditionally, all are familiar with the first and second island defense chain. The idea was to create a third line of defense, which would be complemented by the A2D, which on paper said would be able to take on targets and neutralize them at 1200 kilometers, 1500 kilometers, based on the technology that Prof S Chandrashekar spoke about, of how that constellation of satellite would work together to put together data and arrive at a distilled surface picture, which tells you who are the targets that need to be taken out. There's a lot of correlation that's possible today. We ourselves are doing it in Delhi. Admiral will talk about it later, perhaps during the sessions, wherein we have our own IMAC, where all this data is integrated, that you have a clearer surface picture today than we had earlier. And also the agreements that we have with many of our friendly foreign countries. We have, I think, 12 or 15 foreign nationals today in IMAC who are sitting there looking at the picture, contributing to developing it better, so that you waste very little effort in investigating, prosecuting people who need not be even looked at because the picture is already clear. So those are the dimensions today of the satellite technology, which is, of course, at another level, since there are a lot of youngsters here. It's not just all about military usage. Please remember that when we started using the satellite, we started using it for telemedicine, for remote sensing, for city planning, for water resource management, for green cover. So the amount of application that's available, civil applications, not just military application, is phenomenal. For a developing country, the challenge is always how much should you invest in these projects, developmental projects, and how much should you both are inescapable. You cannot have development without attaining a state of peace and stability. So therefore you need to be prepared, and therefore the kind of efforts that are here today are extremely laudable, and I'm very, very grateful to the scientists who have come here, taking the trouble to come all the way from Bangalore. And I know sensitizing is about the nuances of satellite technology, both for development and for posturing, and for being ready to take on our challenges anywhere, in all the 4 domains. I'm including the cyber domain as one of the domains which again has to be looked at in terms of how satellites would complement that effort. Thank you for this great opportunity to get you all together, and I must also thank my young team, which is led by Bala, Sapna, Shweta, Shubdev Mandal, and Danya. Please stand up. So they are the people who have put this together. So I think that deserve a big hand from all of you. Now we can't see you. Come forward. Others can't see you here. Come forward, all of you. Danya. Oh, here. Yeah. And you also. So these are the people who have put this together. There were a certain amount of glitches. Murphy was at work. Murphy will always be at work. So I keep cautioning my young team that they must always be worried about the presence of Murphy, because Murphy's law is what he wants to implement everywhere. So notwithstanding all this, I think they deserve a big round of applause for putting it all together. And special thanks to all the senior distinguished members of C3S who again come here, and they always hold our hand, and grateful to you. And thank you, Admiral, for taking time off on a Saturday, which is your squash day or golf day. But I'm so happy that you're here. And likewise, Professor Chandrashekar, Professor Ramurthy, Mrs. Ramurthy, who's here also, and Professor Ramani. Thank you. Jai Hind.
Thank you, sir. I now request Commodore R.S. Vasan to present Rear Admiral S. Venkat Raman with a memento on behalf of C3S. I kindly request sir to present a memento to the author of the book, Professor S. Chandrashekar. I now request sir to present a memento to Professor V.S. Ramamurthy, Emeritus Professor, NIAS. I also request R.S. Vasan sir to present a memento to Dr. N. Ramani.
He's not the flutist Ramani, okay? The scientist Ramani.
Now we have come to the end of the book launch. I take this opportunity to extend a gratitude to all dignitaries on the dais and the audience, and extend a valuable thank for extending your valuable time to be here with us today. Let me present that we will be having tea and refreshments at the side of the hall. And audience, please note that we will be resuming our sessions after the tea. So kindly be back here at 11:20. Thank you.
A very good morning to everyone present here. We begin the first session of the day with a presentation by Professor S Chandrashekar on China's A2AD strategy. Before delving into the session, I would like to give a brief introduction on the topic. A2AD is an attempt to deny an adversary's freedom of movement on the battlefield. Anti-access, which is A2, it is denying access of enemy military movement into an area of operations, utilizing attack aircraft, warships, and specialized ballistic and cruise missiles designed to strike key targets. Area denial, AD, is denial of enemy's freedom of action in areas under friendly control. It employs more defensive means, such as air and sea defense systems. As modern military technology is required to uphold A2AD, it is almost exclusively practiced by advanced regional powers, such as Russia and China. Recently, China has emerged as an assertive regional power in the Asia-Pacific with forceful A2AD capabilities, using advanced ballistic and cruise missiles in conjunction with air and maritime defense systems to deter its adversaries in the region. The Pentagon's annual report on China's military strength from 2019 describes the A2AD strategy as a means to dissuade, deter, or if required, defeat third-party intervention against a large-scale theater-wide campaign mounted by China's People Liberation Army. In short, it appears that Beijing's aim is to prevent American and allied military forces from operating freely in the A2AD airspace and maritime bubble around China's coastline. China has in recent years worked to extend the range of this bubble beyond the so-called First Island chain and into the Western Pacific. The key to this effort is not just long-range missiles, but also a growing number of space-based sensors. The US-based Union of Concerned Scientists reported as of 2016, China has 192 satellites in orbit, a number that has only increased since then, with nearly all of these belonging to organizations or companies with close ties to the government and having dual roles for civilian and military use. Some of China's satellites include several payloads that are almost certainly for military purposes, such as an electro-optical sensors, synthetic aperture radar, and electronic intelligence technology. The country also uses a constellation of naval ocean surveillance system satellites, providing persistent coverage of waters surrounding China. These capabilities can also support targeting for China's anti-ship ballistic missiles, and with sufficient numbers of integration, they could provide real-time targeting triangulation data to build up a robust picture of target's location to ultimately generate a targeting approach. With this introduction, I would like to begin the session for today. Over to you, sir.